After the presidency of Richard Nixon and the War Powers Act, the Regents exam only dabbles in a handful of things that it will ask you about. So we are going to hone in on those particular things from 1970 to the present. While running for president in 1968, Nixon had used the term peace with honor repeatedly, saying that he would bring the war in Vietnam to an end, and he did. He negotiated a ceasefire and peace agreement in Vietnam, and the United States officially ended its commitment in 1973, and the last U.S. personnel in Vietnam left in 1975. Détente was a policy Nixon used to try to calm the tensions of the Cold War. To assure peace in an even wider sense, Nixon calls for this easing of tensions. That is exactly how the Regents exam will word détente. Is what was Richard Nixon's use of détente? And it was to ease tensions with the Soviet Union, or to ease tensions during the Cold War. You can see in this picture below that Nixon is meeting with Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks, known as SALT for short, part of his efforts towards détente included these negotiations over both nations' nuclear stockpiles. The SALT agreement between Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev froze the number of strategic ballistic missiles that each nation had at their existing levels. No new weapons could be developed without destruction of old weapons. And that is a very expensive process, so it was meant to limit the increase in nuclear weapons stockpiles. Nixon also visits China in hopes of opening up trade and having a mutually beneficial economic relationship. This does improve relations between the two nations. The Watergate Scandal, perhaps what Richard Nixon is most known for. In June 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party national headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. They were wiretapping conference rooms and telephones, and after a long investigation that included many instances of perjury, which is lying under oath, and obstruction of justice, which is intentionally misleading an official investigation, President Nixon is forced to resign before he would absolutely have been impeached. He resigns in August of 1974. One of the most famous images of Richard Nixon as he gets on the presidential helicopter for the last time. Richard Nixon's Vice President Gerald Ford takes over for him and serves only the remaining 3 years of Nixon's second term. Not only did being tied to Nixon have him in a negative light, but Ford pardoned Nixon for all of his crimes against the U.S. in September of 1974. This is a very controversial action, and it all but assures his defeat in the 1976 presidential election, in which he lost to Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. President Ford can be seen here on the left. Like I said, he served the last 3 years of President Nixon's term, but then lost re-election to Governor of Georgia Jimmy Carter, who can be seen on the right. He becomes the next president. The Carter presidency is plagued by economic problems throughout. One of the big issues that had been created by the policies of the previous 2 or 3 presidents was stagflation, where there is absolutely no economic growth to be heard of, and there's high inflation, which means that the currency people are using to buy things is becoming worth less and less over time. So they're probably not getting raises at work because of the lack of economic growth, and what they do have is not worth as much. Carter suffers the blame, even though this is the cumulative effect of numerous presidencies before him. It's not much his fault, but sitting presidents often suffer the blame for the current conditions of the nation that are caused by either the immediate predecessor or numerous predecessors. The biggest drag on the economy was the 1973 energy crisis, in which the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC for short, instituted an oil embargo against the United States, raising energy prices and only further eating into the already limited salaries of U.S. workers due to the inflation that's also going on. Another energy crisis was caused by the upheaval in the Middle East during the 1979 to 1981 Iran hostage crisis. Carter was failing to negotiate U.S. diplomats' release from their radical Muslim captors, and this hurts him more so even than the economic struggles. One of the successes of President Carter's presidency was a big first step towards a formal peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. Remember that the Suez Crisis during the Eisenhower administration led to Eisenhower issuing the Eisenhower Doctrine, pledging to support any Middle Eastern nation threatened by communism. Part of the Suez Crisis was tension between the British and French, who had built the Suez Canal in Egypt, and Egypt itself, which had nationalized the canal. The British and French were aided by Israel in invading Egypt, which only further drove a wedge between Israel and Egypt. So it's a major step to get these two sides to sit down at the Camp David Accords to negotiate a peace settlement. The bad news is that the United Nations rejects this plan because there was not participation by both the United Nations and the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO is seen to be the organization that speaks on behalf of Palestinians who had been displaced by Israelis when the State of Israel was created in 1948. Not only did the two energy crises and the Iran hostage crisis hurt Carter's reputation, but conservatism seemed to be winning over Americans after 40 years of very liberal policies since FDR. Conservative Republican presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, a former governor of California, campaigned against Carter on many issues. Some of those issues he focused heavily on were that taxes should be lowered to stimulate the economy, the government should be cut back so it is less invasive in people's lives, the 10th Amendment, which refers to states' rights, should be much more respected, the U.S. should have an absolutely unmatched military, and that the U.S. dollar should return to the gold standard after many years of inflation under the Federal Reserve. President Reagan's presidential portrait on the left, and a famous photo depicting him as a very regular guy on the right. Supply-side economics, also often referred to as Reaganomics. Classical liberals, also known as libertarians, believe in a laissez-faire capitalist economic philosophy. This means that the government would have no role in regulating or stimulating the economy. President Reagan absolutely believed in laissez-faire, but he lived in a time by which much more liberal policies had already entrenched government regulations in economics. So rather than a complete economic overhaul, which would probably be a very tough transition for the economy, Reagan instead implemented what's called supply-side changes within the highly taxed and highly regulated American economy. Some of the changes, and this is where the Regents exam will ask you these questions. Deregulation, which is the easing of seemingly anti-business laws, and the lowering of taxes, both corporate taxes and personal income taxes. Reagan believed that these changes would lower prices, control inflation, and would benefit everyone in the long run. Opponents said that this was a trickle-down theory, where the rich received immediate benefits, and it was assumed that the poor would benefit after the trickle of lower prices reached them. Many believe it never did. What the Regents exam will likely ask you about supply-side economics is these two things here, the idea of deregulation and lower taxes. Between 1980 and 1989, tax rates were cut. Opponents to Reaganomics said that this only benefited the rich, and that lower and middle class citizens didn't benefit. Furthermore, the loss of government revenue would lead to a drastic cutting of services and benefits that people needed. However, unemployment dropped from nearly 8% when Reagan took office to approximately 5%. Government revenue also went up from $308.7 billion each year to $549 billion. Proponents of Reaganomics would say this was the increased business activity creating this additional revenue. Lastly, inflation rates decreased from a whopping 13% when he was elected in 1980 to only 4% when he was leaving office in 1989. A political cartoon or joke in which Reaganomics is to start $1 billion business in your parents' garage. Obamanomics is to live in your parents' garage. Throughout his 2 terms as president, Reagan took a hard stance against the Soviet Union. He supported anti-communist efforts worldwide, including the Mujahedeen, which was a radical Muslim Soviet resistance group in Afghanistan from 1979 to 89. In 1989, the Soviets leave Afghanistan. Grenada in 1983, and the Iran-Contra affair in 1986, in which it was found out that the CIA was selling weapons to Iran and using the money to fund anti-communist efforts in Nicaragua via the Contras. Reagan also began a renewed nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. It is really this arms race that leads the Soviet Union to begin spending so much money on its defense that their economy collapses. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, and the Soviet Union itself completely falls apart in 1991. Here's a photo of Reagan meeting with Mujahedeen leaders during his presidency. Osama bin Laden, who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks on the United States, was a member of the Mujahedeen in the 1980s. A photograph, called a fake by some but legitimate by others, of Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and Osama bin Laden, taken in 1979. And although cut off, this political meme showing a photo of Osama bin Laden, and it says, trained by the CIA and funded by the American taxpayer. This shows that sometimes the United States doesn't have the best foresight of what could happen from a risky decision that they make. The U.S. CIA supported the Mujahedeen and therefore Osama bin Laden in the 1980s, only to be attacked by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in 2001. Since we have two Bush presidents, I refer to the first President Bush as Daddy Bush. He is really only known for Operation Desert Storm, in which Iraq invaded Kuwait trying to seize control of Kuwait's oil resources. The United Nations approved a mission into Kuwait to drive Iraq out. The U.S. leads this and very swiftly wins. Operation Desert Storm had President Bush very popular. However, he signed an agreement that would have hiked taxes a little bit, and he had campaigned for president in 1988 saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And when he agreed to a tax hike a few years later, even after the popularity of Operation Desert Storm, this cost him his presidency. Replacing President Bush is President Bill Clinton. He's known for the North American Free Trade Agreement that he signs into law. It's known as NAFTA for short. Praised at the time for being really good for trade, it is criticized today as a tax-free haven for corporations and blamed for the increased outsourcing of U.S. jobs. He's also known for the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, in which homosexuals cannot be open in the military, but are allowed to serve as long as it remains secret. Clinton signed this into law in 1994, but it was reversed by President Obama in 2010. Today, the military allows openly homosexual members to serve. The Defense of Marriage Act, known as DOMA for short, defined marriage as being between a man and a woman. Clinton signed this into law in 1996, but many laws and Supreme Court decisions in the period of 2008 to the present have sided with the individual and supported gay marriage. In 1998, President Clinton is impeached for perjury, which is lying under oath, and obstruction of justice, which is intentionally interfering with an ongoing investigation in some way. This is all over a sexual relationship he had with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Now, be clear that it is not his sexual relationship that finds him impeached. It is the perjury, lying about it, and obstruction of justice, hiding some information about it, that gets him impeached. However, Clinton is acquitted by the Senate and he stays in office. You can see here on the upper left an initial interview by President Clinton. He's wagging his finger and saying, "I did not have sexual relations with this woman." And then on the bottom left, about 6 months later, he's addressing the nation and saying, "I indeed did have an inappropriate relationship with Miss Lewinsky." So, although he had a pretty successful presidency in which he was very popular, this was a pretty bad moment for President Clinton. In the year 2000, Texas Governor George W. Bush, I prefer to call him Baby Bush because of the two Bush presidencies, wins by a very slim 271 to 266 electoral margin in the Electoral College. The state of Florida was disputed, and President Gore refused to concede the election and was going through the courts. The decision Bush v. Gore in the Supreme Court declares Bush the winner because Gore's movement was dependent on a recount of specific counties in Florida. The decision was made based on the 14th Amendment right to equal protection. The court said that recounting only certain votes placed more value on those votes than on the rest of the state of Florida. So really you would have to recount the entire state of Florida. Even then, it would place the value of the votes placed in Florida over all the other states in the country. So via equal protection, or at least that's the argument used by the court, Bush is declared the winner of the election. This is still very, very controversial to this day that the court made that decision. Now, interestingly enough, the recounts continued anyway just to see, even though they wouldn't have had any legal standing, and President Bush would have still won the state of Florida. The War on Terror. In 2001 and 2003, President Bush uses tax cuts to stimulate the economy, but that's not really something he's remembered for. What he is most remembered for is his response to the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. The U.S. immediately invades Afghanistan the following month in October of 2001, and in March 2003 invades Iraq, expanding the war in Afghanistan to a global war on terror. After the shock of 9/11, the Bush administration took two bold but very controversial steps. The Patriot Act. There's a big long name that it stands for, but what it means is that the government is allowed to access telephone, email, personal, and financial records of a citizen without a court order. It's also allowed for searches of a person's home or business without their consent or knowledge. And lastly, immigrants could be detained indefinitely without grounds or a formal arrest for that matter. Very, very controversial violation of civil liberties. He also created the Department of Homeland Security, and the primary mission of the Homeland Security Department is to A. prevent terrorist attacks, B. reduce the vulnerability of the United States to terrorism, and C. minimize the damage and assist in the recovery from terrorist attacks when they do occur within the United States. When asked about the Patriot Act on the Regents exam, the response is simply that it limits civil liberties in the name of national security. And another question, what is one response of the United States to the 9/11 attacks? And that is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. A few political cartoon statements about the Patriot Act. On the left, the Patriot Act, turning citizens into suspects since 2001. On the right, a George W. Bush spoof image of Uncle Sam saying, "I hear you," thanks to unwarranted wiretapping. And in the center, the Patriot Act. Oh yeah, that sound you hear is the Founding Fathers spinning in their graves. Weapons of mass destruction, and is the U.S. the world's police? The justification for the Iraq War was their possession of weapons of mass destruction, known as WMDs for short. Gradually, since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, chemical and biological weapons have been uncovered, but many Defense Department officials believe there could be many, many more that have yet to be found. Even with the possession of weapons, there's a larger philosophical question. Is it the United States' job to be the world's police? Is it our job to prevent Iraq from gaining chemical and biological weapons? It's really up to the individual, but many people think that we should protect ourselves and mind our own business. In the upper left, you can see President Bush's Secretary of State at the time, Colin Powell, giving a speech to the United Nations justifying the American invasion of Iraq. You can see in the upper right the maps that he was using to show where the United States believed there to be weapons of mass destruction. And on the bottom of the screen, a spoof movie that was made about the Bush administration, making fun of the fact that they thought that they were the world's police, known as Team America, World Police. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal made President Bush increasingly unpopular. These images of prisoners being abused by U.S. military officials brought many people to call for an end to the war in Iraq. To this day, in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, there is a U.S. naval base that is home to Camp Delta, which is the detention camp for terror suspects. As of the year 2010, Guantanamo Bay still had 166 detainees. At that time, 100 of them were on hunger strike. The cost of detaining these people was about $900,000 per detainee, or $150 million a year. That compares to only $60,000 per inmate in a maximum security federal prison, or $25,000 a year for the average federal prison. It takes 2,200 staff members to detain all of these people, which is approximately 13 staff members for each one detainee. Halliburton. Vice President Dick Cheney, under President Bush, was a former Halliburton CEO. He quit as CEO in December 2000 after he was elected vice president. But after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Halliburton was given the contract, with no bidding process by the way, to rebuild the Iraqi oil sector. This was a glaring conflict of interest because Cheney was probably still making investment profits with Halliburton. You can see a joke bumper sticker called "I love Halliburton," an image of Dick Cheney on the right, an image of President Bush on the left, and a spoof of the famous flag raising over Iwo Jima, in which soldiers are simply lifting a gigantic gas pump on behalf of President Bush and Vice President Cheney. And finally, President Obama. He's elected president in 2008 under the mantra of hope and change. After taking office, he continues some of the emergency efforts already started under President Bush, particularly TARP, which is just a giant economic stimulus package. He's also known for the Affordable Care Act, also referred to as Obamacare, in which every citizen of the United States is expected to have health care, even if they have to purchase it themselves. If you don't, you are penalized on your taxes with a fine. On May 1st, 2011, a secret mission in Pakistan killed Osama bin Laden by order of President Obama. Very, very gutsy call on his part, and there's some great documentaries out there about not only the intelligence gathering to find out where bin Laden was, but about the raid itself. No different than any president before him, President Obama is known for some scandals. Part of the TARP economic stimulus package was many subsidy payments to renewable energy firms, the most famous of which was Solyndra, a solar panel company, that received billions and billions of dollars of government money, only to go bankrupt within 6 months. This is often referred to as crony capitalism, in which somebody in a position of power, in this case President Obama and his administration in general, gives government money to specific types of companies. President Bush did it with oil companies, and President Obama did it here with renewable energy companies. There's also the accusation out there that much of President Obama's healthcare reform was actually meant to profit healthcare companies by pushing many new people through new federal laws into the healthcare marketplace. The Fast and Furious scandal, in which the government knowingly allowed drug cartels to purchase weapons within the United States and take them over the border into Mexico. A Border Patrol agent was actually killed by one of these weapons. The GSA, the General Services Agency, Gone Wild scandal, in which the GSA had conferences held in cities like Los Angeles and Las Vegas and had lavish parties, meals, and vacation-like activities, all while there was 12 or 13% unemployment in the country. So that was seen as a scandal. The Benghazi scandal, in which Ambassador to Libya Chris Stevens was killed in Benghazi, Libya, with no real United States response. And while running for re-election in 2012, President Obama is accused of utilizing the IRS to target his political enemies who were trying to speak out against him during the election process. He's also accused of attacking Associated Press, or AP, journalists who would speak out against him. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back to the website and take the online quiz. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.